a bit on Laura's. Okay, I'll restart. We just started recording. So basically, Hugging Face put out this blog post like a week or two ago, and it's a very in-depth estimated reading time is like 2 to 3 days, really good visualizations and like little widgets on how to do pre-training of models. So there's a quick overview at the start. The plan is basically we're not covering a 2 day reading in an hour. We'll go through the main points of everything and try to do some little, double click into whatever people have questions on. If anyone has thoughts, comments, pop in whenever. A lot of it is pretty like mathematical guide on how to pre-train a language model. So there's a lot of resources out there for if you're doing fine tuning, LoRa, synthetic data generation. Like there's a lot of libraries that make it easy to do little post-training stuff or fine tuning, but they wanted to solve the question of okay, everyone says like it's hard to train across multiple nodes, multiple GPUs. What is all this data parallelism, pipeline parallelism? How do we know about like who's actually writing about this? So Hugging Face has a cluster of 512 GPUs. They ran 1,000 different experiments, and they basically put together, hey, if you want to go pre-train a model, here's kind of like your 0 to 80% of what you should know about distributed training. So this is when you have more than one GPU and kind of more than two GPUs. How can you efficiently scale your training? So all from you can't have a model that fits on one GPU to how do you have like let's say a 7B model and you want to efficiently use 10 GPUs versus how do you have like multi-node? So if you have a train run, what if you have multiple nodes? What makes up the most of like compute when you're training? So activations, backprop, all this stuff. So TLDR, they kind of kick off with a basic overview of this, and they're like, there's pretty good open source models, but they don't really talk too much about these little nitty-gritty stuff. At a high level, something that this blog post also kind of didn't explicitly state, but does show is you see all these gray dots. So they ran over 1,000 experiments. All these gray dots are failed runs. So some of them were kind of failed force runs, like force failed, where, you overdo your batch size and you know you'll run out of memory. And guess what? You ran out of memory. But the other little interesting niche that I've noticed is when you do a lot of like multi-node, multi-GPU training is sometimes a random GPU fails. Sometimes one GPU has like a weird loss and your train run is kind of screwed. So it doesn't account for those little niches, right? So sure, there's checkpointing, sure, there's stuff like this, but in practice, sometimes when you're training on like 1,000 GPUs, yeah, one GPU randomly dies and it causes little issues. But anyway, this is kind of just the high level, like here's what to do. So kicking off, let's go over the fundamentals and background. So they have this like cool interactive widget that's basically like here are the presets of models that exist for the Llama family. So there's a Llama Tiny, Llama 8B, Llama 70B, and it kind of lets you visualize how much VRAM is required to do pre-training. So if you want to like train the full thing at different precision and at different sequence lengths, right? So as we scale up the sequence length, we can kind of see what happens to the VRAM required, right? So let's say we want to train, there's like a few key parameters that you should know here, right? So you've got batch size and sequence length, and that kind of makes up how much GPU usage you're going to have. So how many parameters, like what's the weight? So this is a 70B. How many batches are you doing? So more batches, more GPU needed, more sequence length, significantly more GPU needed. And kind of like one of the takeaways is, the attention blocks here quadratically increase, right? So as I double the batch size, we double the sequence length, we quadratically increase attention. So if we start with a sequence length of like 4,000, you can see how like the gradients optimizers, these make up like, uh, oh, I did 14,000. As we do about 4,000, the attention is, sure, it's some of it. Like to train Llama 70B at 4,000 sequence length. Activation memory is about 80 gigs. Parameters, gradients, optimization steps are about 300 gigs. Parameters are obviously, it's about 1 to 2 if you're doing mixed precision. You can also toggle that off. So 1 to 2 for mixed precision, then gradients and optimizations, they add a lot. People don't realize that this attention mechanism, it actually doesn't take that much. But as we scale up, let's say to 100,000 context length or a million, this attention mechanism really eats up all the memory. So cool little visualization. The other stuff, I guess, yeah, like hidden dimension, cool, batch size, cool. It's cool how they at least just have these presets for you, though, you know. Vocab size is kind of interesting if you want to kind of see what this is changing here. You could change different activations, but basically, you guys should play around with this. Like, read through this intro TLDR of this blog post. They have like a high level overview. If you want to get anything, just read through this, and you'll kind of have a decent understanding of what's going on, what takes memory when you train a foundation model from scratch, and yeah, okay, let's go to inefficiency. So I guess they ran 4,000 experiments, not 1,000, and then they ran them across different sizes. So 1B, 3B, 8B, the 70B. Here's what crashed. Here's more tokens. I thought this chart was kind of weird to read. I don't know. They wanted it like pretty instead of functional, but I didn't find the charts too useful. By the way, all this context is pretty much pure gold. Um, so high level overview. They're going to look at 3 challenges when you do training, right? So memory usage, this is kind of your hard limitation, right? How many GPUs do you have and what can you fit? So 1 GPU, you got to adjust your batch size, your sequence length. 2 GPUs, how do we do compute efficiency, right? How do we shard the model? Do we put data parallelism where we have the entire model on every single GPU? Or do we do something like shard the model weights if we can't even fit them like that? Then communication overhead, this kind of becomes when you're GPU rich, you know? Most people GPU poor. You have 1, 2 GPUs, you can do some fine tuning, some post training. GPU rich is when you have multiple nodes. So there's a thing called like GPU interconnect, right? So what's the communication bandwidth? It's that buzzword that we hear around pretty often. What that basically means is like when you're sharding stuff between GPUs, they need to talk to each other, right? So like if I have layer one of a model on one GPU and layer two on another GPU, well, they kind of have to sync to do their thing, right? So if they've got good communication, this is basically what NVLink is. If they have good communication, you're kind of chilling. There's stuff we can do. Ring attention is a way that you can like do really long context and you split this really like chunky sequence length. You can do like a million context scaled across multiple GPUs. Now, that only works if you have low communication overhead, meaning, you know, the GPUs talk to each other very, very like closely. So you have one node of 8 GPUs all interconnected with high communication. That's cool. But then when you become GPU rich and you have multiple nodes, how do these nodes talk together? Well, now you have like another level of communication bottleneck, right? So you have nodes that have good interconnect, but the node to node communication, you probably want to do something different. So these are kind of like the 3 main things. Um, if anyone is really doing this, you probably don't need to listen to this yap from me. You probably know more than me, but they give good formulas and like explanations as to how you want to mathematically figure out what's your batch size, what's your sequence length based on your available compute. They have a little cheat sheet here we can go over pretty quick. Um, so small models use single parallelism. You know, if you have 8 GPUs in a small model, you can probably throw the full model on every GPU. If you have a large model and you need more than 8 GPUs, there's tensor parallelism. If you have a bunch of GPUs, there's like MOE parallelism, there's stuff like that. Um, there's a section on optimizing throughput. So tensor parallelism, data parallelism, they kind of have this little cheat sheet. Then they have parallelization strategies, right? So these are kind of the ones that they go over. Data parallelism is pretty straightforward. They give you pros and cons. Then they have 0, 1, 2, 3, tensor parallelism, pipeline, and context. We'll quickly go over all of them, but this cheat sheet is interesting. It seems more like if you're interviewing a research intern, you would expect them to be able to yap about this. But if you're really doing something in training and if you're giving someone access to 500 or 1,000 GPUs, they better not be needing this cheat sheet. But I guess it's useful, you know? Um, yeah. So step zero, this is still kind of that overview, right? What happens when you're training on one GPU? So very, very high level, we know that LLMs are trained to predict the next token, right? So what happens is you do a forward pass of your data, you do like gradient accumulation, you kind of do a forward pass, you accumulate gradients, you do a backward propagation where you update these gradients, you run an optimizer step, and now we have new parameters, right? So interesting little diagram, but this is kind of what's happening when you train on a single GPU. Forward pass, backward pass to compute gradients, optimization step to update gradients and parameters. You basically keep doing this at scale, then you can start batching your inputs. So the interesting thing about this attention, which is taking up all of this compute, right? Out of this 300 terabytes of RAM required to train an 8B at that scale, or let's say 400 gigs of VRAM required to train a 70B at 256, right? All of this little attention blocks, they're really good at running in parallel. So you don't necessarily sequentially do attention, attention, attention. You run all these in parallel. That's what GPUs are good at. So when you're doing stuff in parallel, you want to start doing batching, right? Batching is basically where you do multiple sequences at once. So you have 8 sequences, you throw them in one batch, and then you run the whole batch in parallel. So that's kind of what your batch size is. They're like, forget all that stuff. What we really think about is batch size tokens. Batch size tokens is batch size times your sequence length. So if each sequence is 100 tokens, like 100 characters, and you have 8 batches of 100 characters, you're actually basically just training 8,000 tokens. Um, this is kind of a cool little line, right? So for people not super reading up on pre-training stuff, LLMs are typically trained on the order of 4 to 60 million tokens per batch. So the batch size has been kind of increasing as we get bigger and bigger clusters and we get more efficient training. So Llama 1 was trained on 4 million token batch size tokens. Each batch had whatever many batches times how many ever tokens. So about 4 million token batch size tokens and it was with a batch size of 4 million tokens for 1.4 trillion tokens. So yeah, 4 million batch size tokens, and they trained on a total of 1.4 trillion tokens. Llama 3 was trained on 15 trillion tokens, and I don't know the batch size tokens off the top of my head. DeepSeek was trained on 60 million batch size tokens for 14 trillion tokens. So numbers go up, more efficient training is very cool. So first challenge is scaling our model to have these large batch sizes and running out of memory issues, right? So as much as I want to parallelize everything, um, I'm gonna run out of memory. So the question here we're trying to solve is what should we do when one GPU doesn't have enough memory to hold a full batch of target batch sizes? Well, basically, make the batch size smaller, and if you really can't fit it, then let's start adding more GPUs. But what happens when you can't fit your one batch size of tokens is they want to kind of explain what that is, right? So let's look at what happens in the memory. So when you train, you kind of have a few things going on, right? You have model weights, which is basically the parameters. So parameters are like, depending on the precision, they go into all the math about this of how many bytes it takes per parameter. Then you're computing gradients for backprop. Then you have an optimization state that you have to keep held and activations. Additionally, you need to leave a little bit of a buffer. CUDA kernels add 1 to 2 gigs of GPU memory. So if you're kind of doing local stuff, if you're trying to like do some training on a 7B model and you have like a 4090, 5090, or if you have like a MacBook with 16 gigs of RAM, well, 16 or 24 gigs of RAM doesn't mean that you can use it all, right? Your CUDA kernels take 1 to 2 gigs. Your like screen and general like laptop processing takes a few gigs. So keep that into account. Quantization stuff is this crazy thing. You do mixed precision training where you can kind of keep cut the cut the memory requirement for the model weights. Another thing is that you're not consistently using all the memory, right? So this is kind of 4 training steps of Llama 1B. You see spikes, right? So at 1 second, memory being used was up here, 50 gigs. Then it dropped when it was doing other stuff, right? So gradient accumulation, autograd, all this stuff, it drops. Then it does activations and it drops. So it's like kind of little spiky like this. Um, they go into a bit of math about how to calculate all this, but I think if you're interested in this, you should kind of read it on your own time. It's pretty long. This is always interesting. So they kind of have interesting little tables here that show you how much memory you would need for fixed precision or half precision training with gradient accumulation. Gradient accumulation is a pretty cool little thing where you can kind of, at every couple of steps accumulate gradients and then do a loss over the average of them. Activation memory is another interesting one. It's another thing that, activations take memory. We are running a little slow, so I'm gonna go a little quicker, but if anyone wants to double click into any of this stuff, we can always come back towards the end or just interrupt me and we can go into it now. Um, yeah,
Sorry, just one quick question. And that graph that you showed is on the for epochs, right? Like, so that's the first epoch in by the end of the first epoch, right?
this is just training steps. So
Oh, there's the
it
steps. Oh, okay,
Yeah,
okay.
so steps
Mm-hmm.
could be like, per batch, per
Mm-hmm,
whatever.
mm-hmm,
After
mm-hmm,
you do the training, after you accumulate your loss and stuff, after you do a back prop, there's just a
mm-hmm.
little dip. So this is per batch.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so it kind of
Interesting.
depends. Epochs are just a broader term for this grouping of these, right? But
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you.
similar concept. Yeah. A lot of stuff is one epoch. You don't train as much on the same data anymore. Kind of interesting, but same concept. Okay, gradient accumulation. This is a very fun one. So as you accumulate these gradients, um, yeah, so epoch meta might be shifting to 4 epochs. There's interesting little niches there. So high quality data, more epochs, pre-training data, less epochs. 1 epoch is basically training on a full train, like a full pass through of all your training data, right? So I have 1,000 samples. If I train on 1,000, all my 1,000 samples, that is 1 epoch. 2 epochs would be, do the 1,000 samples and do it again. And there's like there was this whole phase of 1 epoch on 1 trillion tokens is the new norm. I guess new meta is now 4 epochs, according to some paper. Okay, so gradient accumulation. This is kind of interesting, right? So that gradient, storing these gradients as you train is pretty important, right? As we do a forward pass, we have to kind of do a backward pass and calculate the gradients, right? So we predict some tokens, then we look at, okay, what was the actual token and how far off are we? Are we moving in the right direction or are we completely off? For every parameter, for all these gradients, we kind of have to store them. Then we have multiple batches. Then we have to do an optimization. Now, storing this little gradient, these gradients for every single parameter adds up. It takes a lot of memory. So what we can do is this gradient accumulation, right? So instead of doing one entire batch, we split our batch into micro batches. We do a forward and backward pass on each micro batch, compute the gradients, then we kind of average out the gradients as at the optimizer. So if you have a batch of 16, instead cut it up into small micro batches of 4, do forward backward passes, and kind of only compute smaller gradients, and then kind of accumulate them, average them out. It really helps you reduce your memory footprint. There's a bit of an overhead right now because instead of fast parallel computation, we now have to take time to do all this gradient accumulation stuff. But this is pretty straightforward. It's what you would expect, right? Um, I haven't even looked at this chart, but I guess it shows there's a bit of idle GPU when you're doing some of this accumulation merging. So that's kind of your one GPU, right? You take your stuff, you find how much VRAM you have, you take your sequences, you optimize your batch size. If you can't fit batch size, then you can do gradient accumulation with micro batches. There's other little niches like, yeah, when you have too many micro batches, your loss can get a little spiky because now you're doing more little batches. So little niches, if you're actually doing it, you should start to look into. But otherwise, at a high level, that's kind of what's going on here. Now, That's all great. One GPU stuff is pretty easy, right? There's a bunch of libraries that'll help us do this one GPU fine tuning, like full parameter stuff. A lot of companies will do it for us. But what happens when I want to start to like use multiple GPUs, right? There was a whole GPU shortage, but now it's kind of chill. Like now you can rent multiple GPUs. I can go to RunPod, I can go to Prime Intellect, I can go to a bunch of these companies and I can rent like two, four, eight. I think RunPod announced they're soon gonna have on-demand 64 H100s. So let's say I've got like eight H100s or 64 H100s. What do I do? I don't want to just, do a whole batch size and just run it. That's kind of inefficient. So that's where stuff like data parallelism comes into play. So data parallelism is where you basically you put all of the model weights on every GPU or several GPUs, then you split up your data and you run different batches on different GPUs. So, in parallel, you have all the weights and you do training on different GPUs on different batches. Then you kind of accumulate them and you do this optimization and you update them all in parallel. There's a bunch of ways that we do this. There's 0, 1, 0, 2, all this stuff, and we'll kind of talk about that in a bit. But the interesting other little note here with data parallelism is there's this whole crypto bullshit wave of distributed training, and everyone talks about, everyone has one GPU, everyone has one MacBook. Let's train God GPT-5 on everyone's distributed training. What they're actually doing is they're doing data parallelism. So like News Research, Prime Intellect, not to shun on the research they did. It's still very interesting and very unique and like novel and hard to do. They're doing this distributed training, which is, yeah, it's not a meme. It's basically where you have multiple data centers. So like you have one node here, one in Australia, one in Europe, one wherever, and you put the entire weights on them, and then you train batches across there. It's still cool. It still requires a lot of, servers in different locations, but it is still like the whole weights have to be on every GPU on every server. So that's kind of what this one is. It's basically as straightforward as you would expect. Um, you throw all the weights and you do different batches on different stuff, and then you have optimization syncing across, right? So there's different types. You can add gradient accumulation, you can bucket gradients. They talk about like efficiencies to do this, which I think is not what we should cover in an hour. If you're at a stage where you're doing this, they kind of go over what are the main ways to do it. But yeah, that's kind of the two. So we've gone from single GPU training to now we have data parallel where let's say I have a node of four H100s. I want to train a Llama 7B. What I can do is I can throw Llama 7B on each GPU, split my 1 trillion tokens, or let's say like 100 million tokens, split that into batches, do each GPU trains a batch, and then kind of efficiently chunk them together. So this is kind of a summary of what's happened so far. So if you're at this stage, here's what you should do. First, determine the best global batch size by either running experiments or just consume, you know, consult their literature, read their blog post to figure out how you should do this. Then select the sequence length. This kind of takes a lot of compute. What's done in modern models is you train on a small sequence length for like 90% of the tokens, and then the last 10% you kind of increase. So if I'm not mistaken, Llama did like 14 trillion tokens at 4,000 sequence length, and then the last trillion they did at like 100K, then they, upped it. It's very common because it takes a lot of compute. And this kind of works, it generalizes well. But 2 to 8,000 token length works well for the evaluations we have today. I think this is something that people don't really look into enough, right? Sure, you could do 2 to 8,000 tokens because that works for MMLU, but if you're training something like a LLM judge classifier, you probably don't always need 8,000 tokens, right? So be smart and train on less tokens if you need less tokens. Um, then we know the batch size. We can find the minimum local batch size for a single GPU and then kind of increase that till you run out of memory. Then determine the number of GPUs you have for data parallelism, and you kind of throw your stuff across them. So cool. Then you have gradient accumulation if you need it, but that's kind of basic data parallelism. Now we've kind of got this whole series of how do we improve upon data parallelism. We've got 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3. So what is 0? 0 is redundant. Actually, let me also check chat real quick if there's anything. There's MapReduce to kind of do this sync. They have fancy versions of MapReduce as well. Numbers are different for reasoning models. R1 is splitting out. Yeah, reasoning models are a little different, but that's kind of RL. RL is at some level similar, right? You're still just training a transformer. What's happening in that transformer is somewhat irrelevant. Okay, so 0. What's going on with 0? So data parallelism is an efficient way to scale training. The naive replication of optimizer states, gradients, and parameters across DP introduces significant memory redundancy, right? So what's happening here is as you in regular data parallelism, as you split the entire model, you also have to at every single GPU do all the optimizer states, all the gradients, and all the parameters on every GPU. And that's kind of redundancy, right? So what 0, 1, 2, and 3 look into is how can we shard more than just the weights? So can we sort of shard this optimizer state? Can we start shard the gradient partitioning? So, and then there's 0, 3, which is kind of interesting where you start to actually shard the parameters themselves. So 0, 1, 0, 2 are more efficient ways of data sharding. Basically, instead of just instead of everything on every GPU, can we also shard this optimizer state a little bit? And then 0, 2 is, can we also shard this gradient a little bit? Okay, back into what's happening in memory. So in mixed precision training, we have parameters, we have gradients, we have optimizer states, which are stored in higher precision, and then gradients in higher precision if we want gradients in higher precision. So 0, 1 is partitioning the optimizer state. So in regular data parallelism, all ranks gather gradients after the backwards pass simultaneously and perform identical optimization steps. That's a lot of duplicated work. We can avoid it using redundant memory stores at the same time. So they have this all gather, which is kind of it's kind of, yeah, let's shard this optimization state. So forward passes happen at the same time, backward passes at the same time. Perform a reduced scatter on gradients. Each replica performs an optimization step on its local optimization steps. Then you perform this all gather to kind of send these missing replications. PLDR, they're now just sharding optimization. How they do it, they go into more details here. Now, 0, 2 is kind of the next step. We have a reduced shatter optimization where now not only does each replica have to shard optimization, but they're also calculating gradients, right? So why don't we shard this gradient optimization state? So during the backward, instead of performing an all reduce, we perform a reduced scatter. Reduced scatter spreads gradients needed in memory, and it's more memory saving again. That's cool. They have a chart at the end of this that kind of shows how all of this works. Then we have 0, 3. 0, 3 is the fun one. So if you can, or if you need to, if you're training something like, let's say you're doing Llama 70B or something post-training, and you want to crazily increase your sequence length, right? So you want to go up to 100,000 sequence length. Well, now you're not fitting in even one node. This is where FSDP starts coming in, where you have to shard your parameters themselves. So instead of each GPU having all the model weights, now you're sharding the model weights across different GPUs. Sounds pretty interesting, right? Well, in 0, 3, you still need good communication between the GPUs. There's kind of technical ways that they do this, how they do these forward passes, these backward passes. Later on, we'll learn about sharding across different dimensions. The way this works is basically training and all this attention and all of like math, all of this stuff is just matmos, right? It's matrix multiplication, so it's row times column. There's smart ways to do that and manipulate row times column. And Yeah, they kind of just make it really easy to do it. All this explained what's going on, so if interested, read it. If you really want to use it, pretty much any training library, whether that's PyTorch or whatever you're using, you can, in a few lines of code, just implement this and it handles all of this for you on the back end. Now, um, yeah, that's kind of the three stages. Let's kind of take a break here and see if there's any questions. What's the intuition? Okay, for weights, activations, gradients, and optimizer states, it's the intuition for which ones we want in lower and higher precision. So for weights, it kind of also depends on what you're doing. If you're doing training or inference, right? What you're really doing here isn't higher or lower precision. There's mixed precision. For some stuff like gradients and activations, you do them in higher precision. There's more and more stuff coming out about training in lower precision and mixed precision, but the general rule of thumb is you want to use as much high precision as you can afford. Like half precision is cool. For inference, it's different. You can do a lot of quantization, but for stuff like gradients or stuff that has not a lot of not a lot of memory overhead, you want to use higher precision, right? So gradients are small. They don't need a lot of memory. Do them in high precision. Model weights, let's try to lower the precision a little bit. But yeah, okay. Now we have tensor parallelism. Tensor parallelism is a way of more splitting. It's kind of splitting up model weights across their hidden dimension. So data parallelism was, can we shard the weights? This is a way of splitting it up across tensors. So, here's the math of what's happening. You're basically doing matmos, rows, and columns. Here's a smart way to do it. Here's a smart way to reduce it. Here's what we're doing in a transformer block. A lot of this is kind of the background behind stuff like flash attention, group query attention. This is used in papers like Llama 3 and whatnot, but high level, this is just kind of another way of sharding your model. It's done column wise, row wise. There's two different ways to do it. There's different communication overhead in both. So whether you're doing column wise or row wise, um, there's there's different benefits to both. You should look into them.
Every
Um,
little bit helps keep
Tensor
you
parallelism in transformer layers is another
next
interesting one. So
help you make progress on
yeah,
both
that's
fronts.
there. I think for time's sake, we're gonna start going a little quicker. Um, the interesting thing here is kind of this is where as you're all in one node, all this stuff kind of works, right? You can do different layers on different GPUs, but the more you do this, the more important the interconnect between GPUs is, right? So if you're on a single node of highly interconnected GPUs, this stuff will start to be fine. But the minute you're using PCIe cards or multiple nodes, you're kind of adding too much bottleneck for any of this to be worth. Um, yeah. Next, we kind of have sequence parallelism, I believe. Context parallelism. Context parallelism is, or we went through sequence parallelism. Sequence parallelism, kind of same thing. Um, so instead of tensor parallelism, split it across the sequence. This is where stuff like ring attention starts to come in. I think a while ago we had a paper club on ring attention. So for context and sequence parallelism, if instead, you can't scale your context length, you want to take these 128,000 sequences and you want to split them across GPUs. You want to, let's say, have like, first 10,000 tokens on GPU one, next 10,000 on GPU two, and so on. There's kind of this cool little way that you can do this. So you can, this goes into the math about what's happening, but it's kind of, so conceptually, you think, what is attention? Attention is the relationship between all tokens, right? You still need to calculate this. So if you have 100,000 tokens, we need to know how does each token relate to every other token, which, you would kind of expect that to happen on one GPU. You need to look at all tokens at once to do attention. Instead, you can kind of shard them and do this ring attention where you have each GPU do part of the attention mechanism. You kind of sync them. You send QKs between each other. Then you do this BigQuery value calculation, and now you've kind of done attention across GPUs. There's ring attention, there's zigzag attention, there's little optimizations for this stuff, but it's pretty cool. It was a lot of like, how do we get this infinite context? How can we do long context? This is kind of what happened here. Very, very interesting stuff. I think it's a little underrated. So basically reading a little about it is pretty cool. Context parallelism and sequence parallelism. Okay, next is pipeline parallelism. Pipeline parallelism is a pretty fun one. So this is where you distribute consecutive layers. So instead of just sharding gradients or optimizations or sequences, how about we start sharding different layers? So let's have like, layer 1, 2, 3 on this GPU and different layers on different GPUs. This, once again, is like another approach to fitting really large models. It lets you reduce GPU overhead for everything. But once again, like now they go into, as you do this, how do you continue training, right? So they have these like all forward, all backward. So as you do your forward pass, you need to do a backward pass, compute gradients, do optimization. So once you split up layers, they've kind of got, here's what's happening as we want to do optimization, right? So all forward, all backward. There's a few other ways of this. One forward, one backward. This is what Llama 3 did. Very interesting little optimizations to make this stuff work. Interleaving stages. So if you've got different slices, there's just different recipes for all this. Zero bubble, dual pipe. Yeah, expert parallelism is kind of a more straightforward one where you have different experts in a mixture of experts model on different GPUs. That one's pretty straightforward, right? So you kind of have a base router, you have every GPU have its own expert. In some cases, you can have multiple GPUs, multiple experts on multiple GPUs, and you kind of have this efficient expert parallelism. So once again, now there's this kind of overview summary. So what's data parallelism? It's along the batch dimension. Tensor parallelism is along the hidden dimension, so different layers. Sequence and context parallelism are if you need to extend context length and you want to, let's say, train your model up to 500,000 token context, how can we do that on a limited GPU? Pipeline parallelism is along model layers, and then expert parallelism is around mixture of experts. Then we've also got, we can combine these with the zero stages, right? So 0, 1 is sharding optimizers, 0, 2 is sharding optimizers and gradients, 0, 3 is sharding parameters alongside the other two. So this is kind of the high level. If you have multiple GPUs, here are the things that you can do. For each one, they kind of have, here's how you double click into what you want to do. So let's say you're doing pipeline parallelism and you're sharding everything, and you then want to extend your sequence length, right? So let's go back into that section. You can come in and find out what are different interleaving stages. How do you want to optimize all this? What they go into here is kind of still all at the, you're not really doing research here. You're kind of still at the applied researcher stage, right? All this stuff is still available in libraries like PyTorch. So there are CUDA kernels that optimize this. Stuff like Flash Attention is made that already uses all of this. These are things that you can just kind of consume as you're doing your training. If you're pushing the bound, like XAI now has a 200,000 H100 cluster, right? Or GPT 4.5 was a very chunky model. That's where they have to start to push on these ideas and develop even more novel training strategies. But yeah, that's kind of their high level what's going on in different parallelization strategies. After that, we've kind of got, here's a recipe for finding the best training config, right? So if you kind of skip everything, the original intro is kind of important, right? How do we train on one GPU? How do we train on two? How do we train on a single node? Then the middle was kind of, okay, now you're GPU rich, you're probably smarter than me. How do you train across nodes? Some of the reasons for some of these as well, by the way, that we skipped over was if you have multiple nodes and you don't have interconnect, some of these different parallelization strategies will work better. They better optimize for not having that interconnect between all nodes. So, there's recipes for that as well. But okay, high level, let's sum it all up here again. So if you want to find your best training config, how do you do it? So step one, fitting a training step into memory, right? Let's figure out how we can fit a full model instance on the GPUs. There's several use cases, whether you're GPU rich or you're GPU poor. If you're GPU poor, there's full activation recomputation, there's gradient accumulation, there's stuff like that. You can train slower. Basically, you want to increase your gradient accumulation steps to process larger batch sizes, and you kind of do what you do. For GPU rich stuff, if you have models under 10B, use single parallelization stuff. So tensor parallel with 0.3 across 8 GPUs. This is kind of where you shard those model weights across 8 GPUs. For stuff between 10 and 100 billion parameters, you'll need more than 8 GPUs, right? They keep saying 8 GPUs because this is basically one node. If you have stuff under 10B in one node, use FSDP with 0.3. If you have 10 to 100B, you're going to need multiple nodes. So this is where you're going to start to do tensor parallelism and pipeline parallelism, do tensor parallelism with data parallelism, only use 0.3. Then when you're rich with 512 or 1,000 GPUs, you should not be reading this, but there's more stuff that you can do here. GPU poor, we talked about it. Basically, gradient accumulation. Find out what batch size can you support. Split batches, do micro batches, but don't overdo it. Step two, achieve the target batch size. So depending on where step one left us in terms of micro batches and our data parallelism, our current batch size might be too small or too big, right? So what you want to do is kind of scale up data parallelization or accumulation steps. So, keep doing gradient accumulation until you're no longer running out of memory. And if you want to start to do long context, add in context parallelism. So this kind of ring attention stuff. To decrease our global batch size, we can reduce data parallelism and we can reduce context parallelism if you have more GPUs. Okay, step three, optimizing training throughput, set up tensor parallelism using interconnect if you have it. Then there's increased data parallelism. So, if you have more batches, if you have more GPUs, use data parallelism and throw the whole weight on them. Keep the target batch size as big as you can. Try scaling up different parallelisms one by one, and just keep experimenting. Benchmarking, they ran a lot of benchmarks. I don't know if anyone found anything interesting in any of these that we want to dive into, but I want to leave 10 minutes for questions. So I'm going to skip through a good bit of this. Diving into GPUs, fusing, threading. So what is GPU? How does GPU work? There's high bandwidth memory, there's interconnect, there's global stores, there's caching, there's KV caching. There's CUDA kernels and stuff that optimizes all this. I don't think this is as relevant with the high level of if you want to train models across GPUs, what do you do? So if you're interested, read it. It's pretty useful stuff, but at a high level, I think it's a little too niche for our hour. Here's kind of how map moles happened. Let's see. I think there's a conclusion at the end of this. Flash attention is, CUDA optimizations for all this. Ring attention is one. Mixed precision training is another interesting one. Mixed precision training is one thing, but mixed precision inference is another. We have a lot more on mixed precision inference, but for training, they kind of go into accumulation, what to have different precision for different training stuff. FP8 pre-training is kind of interesting. Some people are doing it. We want to see if it works. Recent research, including FP8LM, DeepSeek V3, which is an interesting one. It shows potential. That's kind of huge. So the big thing with precision is basically as you cut your precision in half, you also cut the VRAM needed to train in half. So full precision versus half precision for 600B model means, I can now cut off 600 gigs of VRAM. So pretty big stuff with precision. Okay, conclusion. We now know how to train. We now know how stuff was efficiently trained, like Llama 405B and V3 on multiple GPUs. Once again, they kind of have their cheat sheets. If you want cheat sheets, I think it's good to go over this again. Um, there's a lot of stuff about FP8 versus int8 and how they're not the same. So quantization, yeah, you should look a little bit deeper into stuff like that. Llama's 40 parallelism. What else? A lot of papers, a lot of references. Yeah, pretty solid, interesting little high level overview of how to train it. I think as a quick recap, we should just remember that they have this, here's how to fit stuff into memory. Pick your model size, pick your GPUs, pick your batch size, and optimize your training throughput until stuff doesn't crash. Here are the different parallelization strategies we talked about, right? So data parallel, everything on one, 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3 is where you start sharding the weights, tensor parallel across hidden dimensions, pipeline parallel across model layers, context parallel for sequence length, expert parallel for mixture of experts. Um, Pretty nice overview. I think, for the AI engineer crowd, even if you don't have 500 or 1,000 GPUs, just kind of familiarizing yourself with what's going on, what training, like what parts of model and pre-training takes how much GPU. Yeah, it's not all attention. There's these feed forward layers. There's these activation states. There's these gradients we have to calculate. How those actually take up more than half of your training memory. All that stuff is pretty interesting to know. Then the one thing that this blog I might have missed or it didn't do for me was it didn't mention that, when you actually do inference and you consume this stuff, you're actually not accumulating a lot of these gradients. Let me find this little diagram again. So for example, if we're doing, let's say, llama, oh, that's cool. This doesn't want to work. Let me refresh. So if we're doing llama, where'd it go? There it is. If we're doing llama 3 8B at a sequence length of 1,000, all these parameters gradients that are taking 100 gigs of memory, these optimizers, 70 gigs of VRAM, we don't do this during inference. We don't have to do all this backprop. So the attention is, some of it, but all this other stuff for training is actually a lot less and we can quantize better. So it didn't hit on that as much, but yeah, high level, good read to kind of throw this thing in ChatGPT or Claude or whatever your LLM of choice is. Say you're reading this section, have it break down each section for you. Spend an hour on it. It's useful to know for the AI engineer. Kind of understanding the difference between training and inference is always useful. And I think a good rule of thumb is like if you're hiring a research intern, would they be able to explain all of this to you? Hopefully pros and cons, trade-offs, different multi-node, single node, single GPU. If they could, that's great. And then you should be able to do it yourself too, right? It's just good general knowledge. So pretend you're in an interview, be able to learn all this stuff. It's good background knowledge. But yeah, that's kind of high level overview of this big pre-training blog. Questions, thoughts, comments? We have 5 minutes. I'm sure I skipped out on a lot of stuff. I'm sure people have a lot to add in. Out of curiosity, what precision or state-of-the-art model is trained in? Mostly higher precision for gradients. So there is mixed precision. As of recently, we're cutting that down. I think it said that V3 was trained in FP8, which is kind of interesting, but there's still a lot of precision. Yeah, that's paper. Thoughts, comments, questions? Okay, who wants to train 70B from scratch knowing all this? Are we prepared to blow thousands of dollars an hour. I think it's a good experiment to run. Like, realistically, H100s you can rent at $2 an hour, right? So rent an H100, train a 7B. Rent two H100s on different, like, non good interconnect. Try some of this stuff because it's very approachable from like common libraries to do this training. Then rent a node, then rent two nodes, and like realistically, you only have like a few different parallelization strategies, right? A precursor to this blog from HuggingFace is FineWeb. It goes over like I think 5 trillion, maybe 15 trillion pre-training tokens. So yeah, go learn. Very useful to learn and just try all this stuff and see what's different and burn not too much money, right? $2 an hour for H100s, eight H100s, $20 an hour. Like we can afford this. Papers that can help me do this for non-English languages. The presenter from last time works on a state-of-the-art German model, not German, some multilingual model. So go to Paper Club. Someone is apparently an expert in non English models. Cheapest H100 provider on the internet. Crypto bullshit. The crypto bullshit companies are raising a lot of money and subsidizing GPUs to be very, very cheap. Deep Infra has them for $2. Modo will give you money. A lot of people will also sponsor compute, but also Hyperbolic's a good one. Shout out Hyperbolic. I think it's also pretty cheap, right? Like $2 an hour, $3, $4. SF Compute is not serverless, I believe. SF Compute is bigger cluster at more time. I like the guys, but as RunPod and stuff adds 32, H100, 64, I don't know if we need. But yeah, cool. What other questions? Questions are on where to get GPUs. Pay money. It's not that expensive. Very subsidized right now. Like to a point where it's somewhat more subsidized than compute. People don't like hyperbolic apparently, so never mind. No hyperbolic. We don't like them, I guess. But they are slightly cheaper than the others, but we don't like them, I guess. Okay, volunteers for next week. Who wants to cover paper next week? There was a cool pre-training, post-training survey paper that just came out. I don't know if it's good.
Yeah,
QWQ32B came out. I don't know if
I was
it
thinking
has
the
a
same
paper.
thing. Oh, is the paper good? I haven't looked at
I
it
don't
yet.
think there's a paper. If the paper comes out, that would be cool.
Why you
If
know
not,
paper?
no paper at all. Blog post, which was shitty blog post
Blog
too.
post, 4,496 word blog post. Or in a thought.
They had a very sick title on this, Embracing the Power of RL. 700-word blog post that has nothing but here's code on how to use it. Okay, LLM post training. There's a survey paper on post training. Very cool little chart here. I think it's a good one if someone wants to cover it. Okay, I'm gonna volunteer this one to someone if someone's down. Otherwise, yeah, if there's no more questions. Oh, actually, this is pretty short, so 20 page on post training. Very useful. Graph of thoughts.
Wait, they
Totally
still
loves the
cover
buzzwords.
MCTS.
Ooh,
This
why
is
not?
this is quite a bit.
MCTS is great, dude. You know
Nope.
how much of a
Good.
time sink this was? You know how much time was wasted on MCTS? Who remembers Strawberry? Who remembers Multion saying that they are Q star Strawberry MCTS? Waste of time, but pretty good. And I think it's good background, right? So MCTS is kind of tree search throughout potential next tokens. Can we span out and do inference time scaling, test time compute instead of RL? A bunch of people wasted a bunch of time on this. Some companies said that they are Q star by doing this. But yeah. Okay, another paper that someone has recommended that we don't know if it is credible. The FFT strikes back, an efficient alternative to self-attention from one guy at USC. Is he plugging his own paper? I don't know. Alternatives to attention are always interesting. But okay,
Oh.
that's Paper Club this week, guys.
Super nicely done.
Thank you so much.
You covered 2 days of reading in 1 hour.
Always need to cover quick. Paper's too
In
long.
general, yeah, I feel like there needs to be more good papers. Like I feel like I feel like paper velocity has slowed somehow.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't even a paper on anything of their own. This is just like
But okay, this counts. This counts. It's
okay,
very,
this
very good
counts.
survey.
Okay, well, that's Paper Club, guys.
All right.
Take care.
Thank you.